Now that we've talked about Fort McHenry and about the lighthouses there at the Baltimore Harbor and other areas and aspects around Baltimore, I think it's a good time to maybe steer us away from Baltimore because, as everybody knows, there is more to the state of Maryland than just the city of Baltimore, even though that has a really big historical significance. There's actually another thing that I'd like to discuss, another place. This involves a lighthouse as well, like some of my other stories do, and it involves ghosts. But this situation here is a little bit different because I believe that there's a lot of more historical significance to be had here by where this lighthouse is. This lighthouse is called Point Lookout Lighthouse. It is at the southern tip of St. Mary's County in Maryland, where the Potomac River meets the Chesapeake Bay, and then it's billed as America's most haunted lighthouse. It was built in 1830 by the famed lighthouse builder John Donahue, and Point Lookout was a fashionable resort area with more than 100 cottages where the wealthy spent their leisure time, and then all of that changed, of course, when the Civil War broke out. And if you haven't caught on yet, I'm actually reading something here on a website entitled The Coast Guard Compass, and this aspect of it is dealing with lighthouses and some supernatural stuff. So after the Battle of Gettysburg in the Civil War, the Confederate prisoner of war camp was built just north of that lighthouse. And Camp Hoffman, though the name was rarely used, was in operation from August 1863 until June of 1865, and it was the largest Union prison camp for the Confederate soldiers. In the 2 years it was in existence, approximately 52,000 prisoners of war were incarcerated there. Some 4,000 men died in that camp and then were buried on the site. Then graves were later removed and the bodies moved to other places, their prospective family homes and things, basically is where they ended up moving them. So Point Lookout Lighthouse was only a few hundred feet from the camp's spoke-shaped hospital and served as a stop on the Underground Railroad, providing refuge for escaped slaves from Virginia making their way north. In 1878, Congress authorized the establishment of the Coast Guard Station, which adjoined the lighthouse. While the station became inactive in 1937, it was not formally abandoned until 1948. So Pamela Edwards, who served as Point Lookout keeper during the Civil War, is believed to have been forced to allow Union officials set up in that area inside of the lighthouse to house female prisoners before they were transferred to a federal prison. So this area supposedly became an integration room where torture was often used by the Union Army. Edwards later regretted her decision after seeing the torture and deaths of these prisoners and is believed to have become a rebel sympathizer helping prisoners escape. Sadly, she was removed from her post in 1869. Point Lookout's first 4 keepers died while they were in service. The first keeper, James Davis, died in the lighthouse after only 3 months as service. His daughter, Anne, then operated the lighthouse until his death in 1847. So she was well-liked woman. She often fantasized about leaving the lighthouse to travel, but of course she never did. Richard Edwards became keeper in 1853, but because of a mysterious illness, he died at the lighthouse in July of 1853. His daughter Martha served from 1852 to 1855, and her sister Pamela served from 1855 to 1869. And then, of course, the longest keeper was William Yeatman, who served 37 years from September 1871 to May of 1908. He is buried only 8 miles north of that lighthouse. The ghost of a woman that is said to be Ann Davis, or is Pamela Edwards, has been seen standing at the top of that stairway wearing a white blouse and long blue skirt with a sad look on her face. Other figures have been seen in the basement. Doors mysteriously open and close, and strange noises, snoring, ghost voices, and footsteps have been heard. Voices have been heard coming out of nowhere. Fire, if they got got too close to you, and let us not take objection to what they are doing. And of course, with a lot of haunted stories, we always hear about mysterious footsteps and voices, and I think a lot of people might actually hear those things, whether they believe in ghosts or not, and they don't attribute it to ghosts. Whether or not you believe that these voices are ghostly occurrences, that's up to you. There are, of course, other explanations, but I do like to think that a person's presence can often have their imprint left there after they have departed from place, especially if they've lived there a long time, or certain things have happened there that are really powerful events. So for quite some time, an upstairs room smelled every night of decomposition. Attempts to rid the smell were of no use until a parapsychologist identified a feeling of pain and suffering, perhaps from the female prisoners incarcerated there. Then could it be the soul of the Civil War figures have never left Point Lookout? Or perhaps Ann Davis simply could not leave her beloved lighthouse. Maybe Pamelia Edwards stayed behind to protect something. Then, of course, you decide. As you can probably guess, there are a lot of lighthouses with these kinds of stories. They claim this is the most haunted of lighthouses, but there are plenty of other stories out there. This one has to deal with Maryland, and of course, a lot of these lighthouses are really isolated. So when people go there, they are probably prone to maybe be hypersensitive to potential strange noises as they come by, or maybe the ghosts and other essences that are not of this world will probably just be more powerfully felt where there are not as many people around to disrupt what the ghosts are doing. And now that I've touched upon battlefields and lighthouses and anthems, I want to go into another direction here. As I said, there's more to Maryland than Baltimore, and of course there's some things that are distinctly Marylandish, or whatever the adjective is in this case. There are quite a few interesting creatures that are said to roam the lands of Maryland, and so that's probably where I'm going to go next. And I don't know how many of you realize this, but there's actually the story of a monster in Chesapeake Bay that they call Chessie. So, like Nessie in Loch Ness and Champ in Lake Champlain, the names, of course, are similar to what the waterway is that monster inhabits. The Chesapeake Bay monster's name is Chessie for. But having said that, there is actually a supposed monster in Bear Lake that they call Isabella, and this is Bear Lake that's on the border of Idaho and Utah. So since it's Bear Lake, I mean, what are they going to call it? Barry? But anyways, they give it the name Isabella. But most of the time, the monster's got a name attached similar to the name of the waterway that it's in. And Chessie has supposedly been seen by several mariners ever since the 40s. It is supposed to be a huge serpent that makes its way through the waterways. Champ is actually said to be something similar to that. The Loch Ness Monster Nessie, everyone keeps thinking it's like a plesiosaur, an old kind of sea dinosaur type thing, or something similar with, the long neck and the large body. But Chessie is definitely a large serpent that goes around in the waters and has been said to have been the instigator of several disappearances of ships, where it wraps its body around a ship and pulls it under, kind of like the giant squid that did the same thing out in the depths of the oceans. It's rarely attributed or blamed for a lot of things, but people who see a lot of strange things out there do a lot of times attribute their sightings to Chessie. And of course, one of the little strange things that has happened is that there was once someone who thought he had a sighting of Chessie, but it ended up actually being some kind of orca or porpoise type creature. And so having said that, it's like, well, that means that this monster probably needs to go on some kind of diet, because no serpent should be really that big and fat or whatever. But anyways, it's interesting to go and see the kinds of stories that people have to say about Chessie. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail right here now, but because of the way Chesapeake Bay is, of course, I explained how, the British sailed up Chesapeake Bay in order to get to Washington, D.C. and to get to Baltimore, of course. A lot of sightings of this monster, of course, are seen from the areas around Baltimore, and, of course, other sightings, of course, off the coasts of the bay. And the bay is shared by both Virginia and Maryland, so because of its location that, of course, we give it a Marylander affiliation. There is another story. This one I found quite interesting. Apparently, there is a story about a demon truck. This demon truck is said to roam the foothills around Ellicott City, and as it plagues these roadways with the cars that are going through there, apparently midnight is the witching hour, or whatever you want to call it, around which this truck is supposed to appear, and it goes and it terrifies people who are driving around on that particular highway at night. Many accidents have been attributed to this truck. They don't all agree on what exactly this truck looks like, but any kind of large truck going through there, many people might think, oh, is that the demon truck? Of course, you are going to get people who are going to be telling these stories. You might often wonder how many people really believe these kinds of stories, and that's hard to say, but this is a story out of Maryland. Like the black dog, not everyone believes in black dog stories, but of course those animals are supposed to be precursors to disaster as well, and many people do strongly believe in them. Then there's also the Maryland goat man who is out of Beltsville. Now, this goat man, he is apparently the byproduct of a experiment that went wrong, where they were experimenting on some goats and some humans. Apparently there's some agricultural research being done at a research center, and this man was unfortunately enough to find himself the recipient of something. I mean, I don't know if it's like Spider-Man and radioactivity or whatever, but they don't really say exactly what it is. And so this goat man is someone who roams around the nights and the areas around Beltsville. I don't know if there are any tragedies or disasters attributed to him. I couldn't find anything that talked about it, but a lot of monsters, unexplainable creatures are always said to roam around different areas, especially when you're outside the main cities. And this particular creature, this goat man, it's similar to other creatures, of course, but this is strictly Maryland. And this goat man, of course, scares a lot of people. He is generally not attributed to be a vicious entity or person, whatever you want to call him, but he does scare a lot of people. He can show up in mysterious places. Your first reaction, of course, to anything that's half man, half goat is going to not be a very pleasant one. I don't think he's supposed to look like a satyr does, the Greek satyr creature, but he's definitely someone that you don't want to come across, because sometimes people say that disasters happen, but that's probably only about 50% of the stories about him that have actually been a precursor to disaster. And so anyone who is in Maryland or wants to visit Maryland, there are all kinds of stories there. Great stories. I have not brought anything of the foodways here from Maryland, basically because I did not have a lot of time, I guess, after the last few segments in order to go into that. And the foodways, of course, of Maryland are unique as well. But these stories, lighthouses, ghosts, creatures, those are the kinds of folklore that everyone is thinking about. The folk song or the state anthem, Maryland, My Maryland, you could say that it's not really a folk song because it's top down. It was created by government people for government people, but I think it is still very culturally significant, especially when you delve into the history of things really well. That is what I have to say about Maryland, and I'm thanking all of you for listening to my episode of Béaloideas Folklore Now, and I'd like to bid you adieu and remind you that anytime, if any of you have anything you want to say or you have any questions, anything you want me to talk about, my email address is folklorenow33@gmail.com. And just let me know of anything that you'd like to have investigated, and I'll have a look at it, and I will go into more depth than I generally do here with a lot of these state podcasts, because the state podcasts, I'm trying to get a large number of things out instead of delving really deeply into any one thing. So I am probably going to continue on with the state theme for a little bit, because there are a couple other states that I think are significant that should be talked about and we don't always hear about in our history books. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast, and have a wonderful day, and see you next time.